Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to this session talking about taking ADAS to the next level. My name is Markus Baum. I'm partner in the automotive team from Roland Berger. I'm happy to moderate the session. And with me in the panel, we have Nimrod. He's Vice President for Strategy and Business Development from Mobileye. We have Steve Jenkins, CTO from Veoneer, and Alistair Neverson, head of Horiba. They will answer the questions that I will ask. We plan to run roughly 45 minutes for the panel discussion so that we have about a quarter of an hour for Q&A. But before we dive into the discussions, maybe a quick introduction from all the panelists.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marcus, and hello everyone. I'm Alistair Evanson. I work at Horiba Myra and I head up our Assured CAV business. We're an independent engineering test and development consultancy, and we're focused and motivated on helping the industry provide assurance to the robustness and safety of a lot of the ADAS systems that we'll be talking about today. So looking forward to having a discussion and answering everyone's questions.
And thank you for having me as well, Stephen Jenkins from Veoneer. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and working with the active safety products. Been at Veoneer Autoliv for about 6 years, and Veoneer was a spin-off from Autoliv, working with a lot of integration work towards OEMs and delivering sensors and so on and so forth.
Yeah, hi, I'm Nimrod. I'm SVP of Strategy and Business Development at Mobileye. Like Stephen, I'm also 6 years at the company. In my previous roles, I came from the RAM division that is responsible for the crowdsourced mapping that Mobileye has been developing in the last few years. I've been leading that activity, and recently I started this position, working with partners from the automotive industry and delivering and integrating our products in different ADAS and autonomous driving applications, and really looking forward to this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. And let's dive right into the topic. The first question, what are the main drivers from your point of view for ADAS adaptation, and which regions will take the lead in the next years? Nimrod, would you start?
Yeah, I think looking at it from a very broad perspective, I think that the current demand from consumers will be concentrated in three facets. One will be a dramatic increase in safety, an improvement in safety of driving. The second will be a significant reduction in the amount of time that regular people need to spend driving their daily commute, and the personal tax that each and every one of us is paying on a daily basis just driving around. And the third is enhancing the experience, or we can say delivering new types of experiences while you're in the car, and pretty much transforming what the driving experience is today. I think these are three aspects in which we're going to see tremendous progress in the next few years, and where there is the most concrete demand from consumers.
Stephen, anything to add, or any point of disagreement?
No, definitely no disagreement. I mean, I think that we're all aware that the architectures in vehicles are becoming supercomputers by themselves, and what you can do there and how you can serve the end user is, of course, being greatly enhanced by this fact, as well as having connection to edge computing and high definition maps and so on as well. What I'd just add maybe is that, I mean, what we need to really build is the trust with the driver. So whether this is level 2+ or level 3 system, it needs to be, seamless, and it should feel logical. And so, I mean, going into a vehicle when you get into level 3 and being able to continue your, the more enhanced version of yourself, which is able to do other things than drive the vehicle, is of course what we're looking for, but you need to build that trust before you can get there.
Alistair, did you forget anything?
No. I think everyone's covered the main topics there. I mean, the other thing, and I'm sure we'll come on to this later in the discussion as well, but obviously driving the kind of adoption rates is regulation as well. So there are some topics that are around us at the moment around GSR2, where there are some mandated kind of ADAS features. At the moment, those are the kind of lower levels that we experience. but clearly, as those increase, we'll see an increase in the requirements to actually have those fitted to the vehicle. And to echo what the guys have been saying, those are obviously focused predominantly around safety and ensuring that the technology that's brought to the vehicles really enhances the safety of all of those road users.
Thank you for bringing up this topic. I mean, let's wait a second before we discuss the regional differences. I mean, in my daily life, I experience first discussions about, are we doing the things a little bit too quickly and making mobility too expensive? I mean, I agree with all of the things that you've said. That's the only negative point that I have witnessed the last year, saying, okay, e-mobility makes for the lower part of the income range mobility more expensive, and now we do the next thing on safety. Any answer on this one?
I can start with saying that there is maybe a different way to look at this question, and you can ask if we're doing enough in order to improve safety, because if you look at the numbers and if you look at the trends and the occurrence rate of accidents and fatalities in pretty much all all levels of society everywhere on the planet, it continues to be a very significant factor. And I think that in this industry, whether it's suppliers, car makers, tier ones, whatever it may be, we have a common obligation to deliver much better safety to consumers. And as we move forward, the more cars will be on the road, the more freedom we want to enable to citizens. We will need to make sure that these systems are safe. And I think that the more safe that they will be, the value that is brought from these cars to consumers will also be higher, and that can justify some of the price increases that you're referring to.
Agree.
I will put it in a different, just to finish, sorry, just a different question. How much would you pay for a car that you will know that your kids have a zero chance of being involved in an accident in? What's the value, and how much are you willing to pay for that type of car? I mean, that's kind of a question we can think of, right?
Yeah, and I completely agree. I mean, we come from the safety background as well, and of course that's a really important thing for us. And I'd agree with you, Nimrod, that it's very important that we think about it. As long as nothing happens, there's no problem. But when something happens, you would have paid that money in a second, in a heartbeat, right?
Yes.
And you could also compare it to what happened with safety belts or airbags or any other systems that came in. They made the car more expensive intermediately. Then you got volumes of scale, and then it was a standard option and everyone expected it. And I think that's where actually the regulations is helping us to put that through faster, because of course we want to get that out as soon as we can. And of course, and I do believe when you get the economy of scale and you also get the, you look at the whole system architecture, you can actually make improvements to bring down the cost as well for the the average user of a vehicle.
I agree. Coming back to the second part of my first question, do you see major regional differences in the drivers for an increasing ADAS adaptation? Alistair?
I think if we look at areas of Asia, obviously the likes of China is very active, and you'd expect China to be active in this area. It's very advanced in its technology thinking. Likewise, places like Japan. You've mentioned before, and you kind of nodded to the inclusion and the mobility aspect of autonomy and ADAS. And I know that in Japan, they're working on a legal framework for level 4 vehicles that will support inclusive mobility for people and populations that are in rural areas. And that's obviously a key aspect to it. Here in the UK, we obviously have a lot of work that's being done by Centre for Connected Autonomous Vehicles and others that are helping to kind of lay the groundwork for allowing technologies to be adopted and widely adopted on the road. Within Europe, obviously, Germany is incredibly well placed, not only because you have a very large ecosystem of OEMs and tiers that exist, and also that there's a large degree of level 3 systems, so things like highway autopilot and ALKS, and moving towards level 4 systems with automated valet parking and so on. that are already available in the market or are coming to the market soon. So I think really it's an even spread across the world, and there's perhaps different pockets and different geographies that are perhaps focusing on ADAS and autonomy to solve specific challenges that they have within those geographies. But clearly there's a sharing of experience and a sharing of technology.
Anything to add?
Yeah, maybe just to say that I think that the way that rate of technology change has happened has kind of leveled the playing field somewhat. And I think that's what you're describing, Alistair, in the last 10 years. The connectivity we have between us, probably also some parts of COVID, and the expectation levels have risen quite radically. So, I mean, I think if you went back 10 years, you would see bigger pockets and differences between. Of course, the OEMs want to focus on the target where they have the most customers. So generally, they try to get the introductions into the US and Germany or Europe, and then China and Korea, for example. But, I've been in India recently, and they're also doing a lot of advertisement on TV and so on to try to bring the awareness up on these systems as well. And I think the fact that it's easier now to enter these markets from a perspective, we are more global, and each regulation is kind of more copied between those geographic locations. It gives us an advantage to get it out faster.
Right. Having discussed the drivers, how do you see the market evolving the next decade and maybe even beyond? Looking for both areas, the more regulatory, purely safety-driven market, as well as the high end of the market, really enhancing the comfort. Nimrod?
Well, I think it's a very complicated question. A lot of things can happen in 10 years, and I'm not going to be the one who are going to make ambitious predictions about the future. However, I mean, if we would look at the rate of innovation and progress in this industry in the last 10 years, it shows us a little bit about how humble we need to be when we anticipate 10 years from now. And I think that the opportunities are endless, and there is a perfect storm right now of maturity of some technological components and maturity in compute and efficiency and costs of compute units, and several technological advancements in AI and other fields that really make a lot of the next generation of driver assist and autonomous driving that are the foundation for much improved safety and much improved comfort, a lot more accessible to volumes, and not just in science projects and in pilots. And I think we will see increasing proliferation of these type of features and products in these 10 years.
But no bet on when we will have level 4 available.
Yes. I don't think I don't think necessarily. I mean, that's the interesting question. I think the important thing is that the industry is progressing towards that direction. And in this path, there will be increments and quantum leaps in progress and groundbreaking products that will make a significant impact on daily lives. And I think that's the important thing, and that's the message that we should convey. It's not a 0 or 1 game, in my view.
I completely agree with you, Nimrod. And again, it's about lifting the bar all the time, every day, whatever we do, and trying to make that bar higher and higher. And we do that through regulations, which is a support, and we do that through innovation, which comes out on the higher tiers of the vehicles as well. And as you said, I think you're spot on. A perfect storm right now of all the things happening at once. The interest to enter the market from players that were not in the market before. The advantages of suddenly having processors that can manage all of this adaptation and the speed needed, 5G and other types of things. They're all players in this as well. And I mean, I think we were quite vocal from Veoneer, and I dare to say that we did not believe that the level 4, level 5 would come as fast as it would come. And I think it's an iterative process, exactly as you described.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think obviously we'll see more sophisticated features and products, and those more sophisticated features and products are going to take on more of the driving tasks, which will occur in more complex scenarios. And that means, increasingly long journeys that will be undertaken where the occupant of that vehicle can kind of have a hands-off, eyes-off approach to things. But Within that, there needs to be, more sophisticated sensors, more sophisticated redundancy, and so on, that enables that to be implemented in a safe way. I think probably touched on as well how you mentioned before about cost, and we're likely to see a reduction in hardware cost within that time that will allow people to access those features in their vehicles. And Stephen touched upon it when we were having the introductions, but the key to that is achieving consumer acceptance. If those systems are mandatory within the vehicles, the occupants need to understand how to use them. If they're optional, clearly they need to work well enough that a consumer is incentivized to actually add that option onto a vehicle that they will be in and they will be using as well.
I mean, I totally agree. It's very hard to predict how quickly technology will progress. So it's really gambling to put a date out when certain features are available. But do you see major differences in interest in ADAS features, or major differences in the regulatory pressure applied to improve the safety between the regions?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, if you look, for example, in Europe, there's regulations around that are specific for Europe that haven't gone over to the rest of the world, and some in the US that haven't come over to Europe again, and so on. It's about the specific problem you're trying to solve. Like, if you think about driver impairment, that's something that's very specific to some countries in Europe and the US. Or, nighttime regulations is very interesting for the US. And then if you have the Nordic countries, you have also things like vulnerable road users at night and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it's flavors, but I think the underlying goal is always the same, independent of which region you're in.
Understood. If you look at the penetration increase, or the higher penetration that we will hopefully see the next years, what are the main challenges to really achieve a level that you would say, okay, we can't do much more when it comes to safety, or when it comes to really making driving a more comfortable, a more pleasure thing to do than it is at the moment? What are the main challenges? Nimrod?
Well, I think it's a very complicated engineering and execution problem. And there are a lot of very strong and sophisticated concepts and architectures on how to achieve that goal. And right now, I think the primary focus is towards how we can really create enough data, enough processes for iterative validation, improvement of the technologies, robustifying the technologies, certifying the technologies. And it becomes a non-trivial engineering task in order to really create eventually in data, it's not just about the quantity, it's about the diversity, it's about the easy access to data, how efficiently you can extract the most important examples or the most important use cases, and how well can you measure yourself objectively based on these examples. And I think the more we dive into the next generation of products, the more we will need to be able to access these corner cases and edge cases that start tackling the long tail. And the long tail is very, very long in this field. So
I agree. Alistair, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's an area that I'm sure all of us could talk for a very long time on, because there are a number of challenges. If you're thinking of what we're trying to do in terms of achieving a North Star of limit on accidents or zero accidents, compliance isn't always enough for that. Legislation is providing guidance, but actually to go to achieve zero accidents, you need to be far more than what's required within that compliance, and really understand that robustness. And Nimrod touched on a few of those topics there related to really understanding the system performance, understanding how that system will act in different environments and different scenarios, making sure that you have that evidence, making sure that you're not just testing to prescriptive standards, but you're actually really challenging that system, making sure that it recognizes diversity in a number of situations, recognizing that it has quite a wide operational design domain that it needs to work in. I think another of those challenges is how you prove it. That's a really big challenge. There isn't areas and geographies that have necessarily put heads on blocks to say how safe something needs to be before it will be permitted to go on the road, and therefore the onus is on the kind of OEMs and others to basically generate or to demonstrate the safety of that system. Providing that kind of robust evidence pack is by no means a small feat. And clearly we have the kind of movement within that whole area of moving from a kind of personal to a product liability, and people assuring themselves that they have that evidence pack to really demonstrate the power and performance of the systems that they've developed and proved out. And I think that's really kind of fundamental and important, is to how to kind of overcome those challenges, is really being able to show that that system is robust, and really have that experienced in a real world. And by doing that, we will achieve consumer acceptance. We're not going to get to a point where there is a large adoption of the technology if people are sat in those vehicles on part of their journey, and you can be sat in the nicest car in the world, but if that car only drives at 10 miles an hour or 20 kilometers an hour because the hazards that are present in its operational design domain mean that it can't function any faster, people aren't going to choose it, whether that's a private vehicle or whether it's a mobility as a service operation. So yeah, we need to kind of focus on the robustness and resilience of those systems, both from the consumer perspective as well as the overarching kind of safety area as well.
Thank you. I would like to throw in two additional challenges that become in our daily work across. I mean, at the moment we see, due to regulations coming from the US, somehow a technology separation between China and the rest of the world. Do you see a major impact from saying that we will have an ecosystem on the semiconductor side and maybe also on the software side for China and for the US, driven by US regulation? Do you see a major impact for the ADAS adaptation? Stephen?
I mean, it could result in that as well. Of course, it depends how harsh those regulations end up being as well. At the moment, they're quite, I wouldn't say they're not tight, but they're quite loosely defined when it comes to performance needed to do that. But there is a kind of concern about this, of course, in the industry at the moment, and it could result in those two differences. I would say the thing that speaks against that is the fact that there are still manufacturers that want to supply their cars to all geographies, whether they're from the US or not, and that will, of course, aid the kind of smoothing out in some cases as well. So I'm not as concerned yet as I could be in the future, depending on the lockdowns.
Nimrod, agree or disagreement from your side?
I think it's a very quickly evolving situation, and the dynamic nature of this question comes from a lot of geopolitical developments that we don't have full access to all the information that really drives them. We can say that in the automotive industry, obviously there is a lot of overlap between the Chinese market and other global markets. As Stephen mentioned, there are a lot of European or Korean, Japanese, and American car makers that are, see China as a primary market and the leading market for sales, and therefore there is a very strong interest to maintain the current trade relationship between China and let's say the Western world and other markets. And we think right now we see that it's a very important aspect not only for Chinese OEMs but also for Western ones, and that's why we think it's going to be a kind of a balancing act between what comes from the businesses and what comes from the governments.
Agree. Second challenge is that I would like to throw in two things. Would it help to make the progress of ADAS faster if we would have a more standardized approach when it comes to EE architectures between the different OEMs, or is it something that is not that much of a limiting factor or challenge from your point of view, Stephen?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that standardization where we can get benefit is go back to the answers from Nimrod and Alistair on the question, a couple of questions before, basically, is that to get things out faster, I'm missing the standardization on how we work together on data collection, on data usage, on simulations and things like that. And so I would say the architecture itself in a vehicle is actually quite easy to piece together. I wouldn't say that's the biggest issue. You have nodes, you have ability to communicate between the nodes, and different vehicles will have different levels of complexity depending on the vehicle fleet, the size, the scale, the price level, and so on. But outside of that, all of the data we collect, everything we do, it's in a lot of cases just duplicated, triplicated, and it's not useful for anybody more than, you know, it's just we cannot work together because we're competitors. And I think if we can solve that problem instead, we can get things much faster. And you can get lost in the data. You can collect, you know, millions of kilometers of data that's not useful instead of collecting the data that's useful for everybody and use it between them. And there's also other standardizations you could do in the vehicle architectures and you know, the ways we communicate as well. Operating systems or underlying subsystems that don't make any sense for the end user to be paying for, but are of course helping us to make progress faster.
I can add that you know, architecture is a means to an end. Eventually, it's not what necessarily the consumer's experience when driving in the car and experiencing the features. It's a means to an end that is very important, obviously, and it's important from cost perspective, from, you know, simplicity and efficiency perspective, and it should not be overlooked. But eventually, it cannot compensate for, let's say, low performance levels from the actual technology itself, from the software that runs on this architecture. And the biggest advancements will come from the direction of software and the development of sensors and sensor fusion and you know, the improvements in each technological component that comprises this system. And the architecture is the vehicle or the, you know, the enabler to make that integrated into the vehicle.
Is there anything to add?
No, I do completely agree with, as Nimrod said, it's yeah, certainly the enabler to creating a good end product rather than the driver for it.
If you could have three wishes, and then coming back to all the challenges that we discussed already, what are the three ones that you would have to be fulfilled to make the progress of driver systems faster? Alistair.
Well, $1 million question. I think I think an element of standardization is important. I think that for us to speed up the adoption, that's clearly a requirement. There needs to be the consumer demand and support in making that economically viable for consumers and for fleet operators. Then certainty as well. You know, certainty is a challenge that creates cost. Or sorry, uncertainty is a challenge that creates cost and creates risk, and being able to reduce both of those factors really help in pulling those together. So whether that's regulatory certainty, whether it's kind of protocol and so on, but yeah, providing certainty to the industry is certainly something that's really required.
Stephen, your three wishes.
I mean, I think I would wish we could come through this kind of this phase that every industry goes through when they're making change, which, you know, is everyone tries to do everything, everyone tries to harmonize, everyone tries to work together, and then you jump over that. So my biggest wish would be we could like speed through those uncertainty phases and end up at a collaboration goal at the end, because at the end of the day we all have the same goal. We of course want to provide good products to a full system. And if we can do that by working together better and doing it more as a collaborative approach with both the OEMs and every other tier one, I think that would be my biggest wish. And the other two are small enough to not count compared to that one. So.
Nimrod, the last one around.
I don't know. Maybe it's personally. I don't have a lot of wishes, but if I can wish for one thing, I would say that with all the dynamics of what's going on in the world, the aspect of the safety aspects and the fatalities and accidents and the price that society pays for that is I would simply wish it will come to a higher place on the list of things that humanity needs to address. I think it's slightly underestimated or understated today. And there are many different things that take the headlines. However, in pretty much every country, it's a significant reason for fatalities, and it breaks down families, and it's a real tragedy when it hits you home. And I think we need to take that, focus on that, collaborate in every facet we can, and find a common goal that the entire industry, including the government and the political space, can work towards and really make advancements in.
Agree. Taking this ambition or this objective of our technology progress, how far would you three go? Saying, if we come to the conclusion that as long as the human is involved, we cannot make the system failure-free. We will always have fatalities. Would you go as far as saying, okay, then we need to do the step and say it's only allowed to drive with machines?
So the question is when again?
Again
with the when questions.
No. Then first in general, and then we maybe can discuss.
I would refer to a different industry maybe that experienced some of the same questions a long time ago. And if you look at the aviation industry and what happened with commercial flights, for example, and the improvement in safety and the chances of being involved in a fatal plane crash today as opposed to what it was 50 years ago, it's incomparable. We're talking about many orders of magnitude of improvement within 2 decades. And most of that, a lot of that came from maybe, different material, better engineering, better engine, better design. But there is a very significant component of removing the pilot and human error out of the equation. And the more automation and the more redundancies and the more systems came into play, the better and safer the flight experience became. And I think we're going to experience the same thing. And we all know that being drivers, that coming from a company that is on a daily basis busy developing autonomous cars and driver assist systems, how much the average driver is irresponsible, unconcentrated. You cannot really trust anyone. The more and more we get distracted today with smartphones and the notifications and what's running in our head, the more I think it becomes necessary and not a luxury.
Even would you agree that we need to hand over more responsibility to the computers in order to make our daily driving safer? And second sub-question, is there a general agreement in the society from your point of view that we should do or need to do this step?
I mean, eventually it will happen. That's the first answer. I just don't know when eventually is in this case, right? That's how I just put my caveat. But I'm a pilot as well, a private pilot, and I agree with Nimrod completely that the accident levels, because of the education, because of systems in the airplanes and so on, has radically improved. You can still get cases where it doesn't work, like the 737 MAX scenario, where there's some issue where we can see, that there was not control on that system.
Yeah.
And I would say, but one thing I'd like to challenge there is I actually don't think the human driver is that bad, right? There's a lot of scenarios where the human driver is working really well, and that's the part of me that drives on the racetrack. But it's like, but seriously, when you're driving along and you're in an environment where things are easy on you, like on a long motorway or something, that's the easiest ODD for us to solve as well. That's the one where we can get very quickly to that goal of giving over the steering to the car. And I think once you build that trust, once you get up to the level where you can trust it, it doesn't make any sense to have the driver in the loop. But at the moment, there's so many scenarios where you have to solve with autonomy that it doesn't really make sense to take them out of the loop either. So, you know, you can a human can still interpret situations that it's difficult for a machine learned or any other type of system to understand. So I think, yes, we will get there for sure. And when we get there, it will be much better than it is today. But we have mixed modes in the vehicle fleets today. And we also have a driver which can handle scenarios that we can't handle with those type of systems. But as soon as we get there, it will make exactly, as Nimrod said, the sense to remove the driver from that situation.
Yes, I mean, you talked about a lot about customer acceptance. What's your point of view on this?
Yeah. So if I look at my own personal circumstance, you know, I sit very close to the kind of operational design domain that Stephen's just identified. Really, my commute when I go into the office is on motorways and the strategic road network, but then I have a kind of shorter, you know, 3-4 miles either side of that are on quite local roads that you would find edge cases on, you know, related to animals on the road or, you know, things like that. As a consumer, I'm very happy to hand over the driving task of the kind of mundane traveling on that motorway network, with the acceptance that, you know, some part of it at either side I need to take back control, knowing that, you know, perhaps the systems aren't quite there yet on some of the more kind of complex operational design domains. Within that, you know, it's just making sure that when you are on those straight roads, vehicles in front of you, that the systems are operating to the level that you would expect, and that the consumers have been educated enough to know the difference between when they do need to be engaged and when they don't need to be engaged. And I know that there's a lot of press around this currently, whether you're looking at false advertising claims and various kind of things like that, where consumers are perhaps a little unsure about whether they're in a fully autonomous vehicle or if they're in an assisted vehicle. And that's really where that kind of consumer education piece needs to come in, so that you can identify exactly when you need to be engaged in the driving function and when you can be more passive.
If I understood you correctly, you see for quite some time a mixed world computer, in some situations, human drivers taking over responsibility in other situations. From your point of view, who should decide who's in the responsibility? Should be decided by the machine saying, I can't handle the complexity anymore, or needs this responsibility always in the hands of the driver? Stephen.
I mean, that's actually quite well defined to some extent. Say that as soon as you go from level 2+ to level 3, level 2, level 3, it's suddenly you have to have the ability to hand back over to the driver in level 3. Yeah. So that means that the computer does need to know when it's not functioning enough to be able to have that control. And I think that's the biggest issue, right? Because how do you know that without having to identify every scenario that could happen? And yeah. I think that's, you know, the tricky part. So we can solve at level 3 for specific ODDs because that's easier than to do it for the whole population. But then when we start to add that little function there at the end, then it's very important that it understands exactly when it can't function anymore.
I see nodding on both of you, Nimrod.
Yeah, I'm just agreeing to the message. I think that that the transition between a hands-free driving application to an eyes-off driving application is significant. And in the moment that the driver is allowed, and the car maker officially allows the driver to remove the eyes off the road during the driving, the level of complexity of the system increases, because you need to take care of not only the driving task itself, but also all the fail-safes and all the fail operations and all the what ifs, and what happens if the driver is not responsive, what happens if the driver is not taking control when the system disengages. And you still need to the system needs to be designed such that it can cope with all these questions without creating accidents and without creating dangerous events. And I think that's why you see some sort of a trend where a lot of level 2+ products are emerging, because the level of complexity is kind of more in the sweet spot between value and complexity, as opposed to the eyes-off functions.
So you see still a long time that we have level 2+ functionalities next to
I don't. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I don't think that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that there is a trend where a lot of projects that started with a certain goal are being, descoped into this level 2+ as sort of an intermediate step towards the end, like higher level of function. I do think that in the next coming years we'll see more and more level 3, level 2+, these either hands-off or eyes-off functions become a lot more proliferate, and I think it's a wave that is already starting, and it's becoming more and more pervasive in more and more OEMs. And I think it's the trend has already started, and it's going to be significant.
I think a lot of resources are redeployed into that as a target as well, which is of course good for that goal. When there's more people working on it, it can go faster. And I think technology-wise, I think you're saying the same, Nimrod, we actually can solve it, we believe, today. And we would be, in the 26 to 27 timeframe, be able to do that in vehicles that are out into people's hands. But it's more about, putting the right resources on it, making sure it's working properly, making sure all the regulations, everything are followed to get to that point.
Mm-hmm. So your point?
Yeah, I mean, again, it comes back to the use case, doesn't it? I think there are high levels of autonomy that are relative quick wins. So I mentioned before about automated valet parking. That's a system that is widely discussed, and for a specific geofenced area, something that's relatively easy to achieve. Likewise, there's a lot of trials around the world that have autonomous pods for first and last mile, and again, you can generate a safety case related to that type of operation where you have relative low speed, not always in mixed traffic scenarios. So it's really about taking the incremental steps and learning, taking some of those first adoptions and scaling them up. Clearly, high-speed applications are some of the most complex because you need the vision to see obstacles a long way away. You need to start building in actuation related to kind of lateral control and various kind of things like that, and that can really start to kind of affect how that vehicle feels. But there are low-hanging fruits that exist that are able to be achieved in the short term.
Good. I mean, you mentioned geofenced areas and saying the challenge of mixed traffic. Do you see some kind of movements in some regions that, in order to make public or private transport safer, that we will have geofenced areas where it's only allowed to drive with computers in order to make the system safer?
I don't think. I mean, I relatively talking around kind of car parks and so on. I think maybe for tourist attractions and likewise where you don't kind of have a high level of interaction with mixed traffic. I don't think we have the luxury in the world where we have enough space to necessarily segregate use cases, and from a sustainability and arguably ethical perspective, I don't think we want to be building new concrete and tarmac roads just to allow autonomous vehicles to drive without mixing with other vehicles. So I don't think that's necessarily the right approach. But where they perhaps have those areas already defined, then it can be a relatively easy application. Where it's not, it just comes down to making sure that system and Stephen and Nimrod develop these systems and test these systems on public roads anyway. It's just really building the confidence that before you deploy that system, it's had enough exposure to dealing with other traffic and other actors and has been rigorously tested.
And obviously, I think the target or the optimum lies somewhere between the balance between safety and usefulness of these systems. And in order for it to be really adopted by consumers, it needs to be at the exact right spot in this spectrum. And obviously, if you're optimizing for safety, which is you cannot underestimate the importance of safety, but designing a system that will drive in 10 kilometers per hour and will stop for 30 minutes in a stop sign, you simply cannot deploy it in real streets. So if you really want to make an impact, this system needs to proliferate and need to reach high volumes. And if you want to reach high volume, it needs to be useful, and it needs to be able to take you from point A to point B at a reasonable time. And if it normally takes you 30 minutes, and now the system will take 10 hours, then nobody would really use it. So if it will take it like 32 minutes instead of 30, that's marginal. Right?
Yeah, I agree.
Time is the most expensive resource that each and every one of us has. So I think this balance is extremely important. Therefore, I don't think we should talk about segregating or building new infrastructure for autonomous vehicles. I don't think it's in the question.
Great. Before we move on to the Q&A part, saying in 10 years from now, could we have a similar discussions about that we need to improve the safety on road transport, or could we, in your view, have achieved a level that everybody says, okay, the next steps would be so expensive and would have so strong limitations in other areas that it's not worth it? Even.
I mean, I think we shouldn't look at that from the eyes we have today, right? That's the problem. So if I look back and I look at a car I bought 2005, 2006, it had basically no features at all. And then 2015, I had a ton more features. And I probably would have said in 2005, this probably won't be possible. And maybe I would have argued that even a smartphone was unpractical, right? So I think we need to look at it with the fact that by that time we will have learned so much and done so much, and there will be so much evolution that we will have a different answer to that question. So I don't think by that time it will be overly expensive to go to a different level of automation or a different performance level. I think we will have done a lot of changes in the next 10 years to get to that point. I know that's avoiding the question a little bit, but that's how I feel. I feel like we're making massive changes every single year. So I mean, and I'm sure the others in the call will agree that the things we did 5 years ago are very different than the things we do now already.
Yeah, I think the important thing that maybe gets misunderstood about developing autonomous vehicles and these types of systems is that it's a very unique technological challenge in the way that normally technologies are divided into two groups. Either it is very innovative, state-of-the-art, or it's something that cannot break. And normally, if you're designing a system that simply cannot break, never, it won't necessarily have the latest technology or the, from a scientific paper and implemented the neural network on this can't-fail system. And autonomous vehicles are both. And there are not a lot of examples of technologies that are both, that needs to operate at very, very high levels of robustness and reliability. And also, in order to achieve that, because of the nature of the problem, you need to deploy, the cutting edge technologies, and the arena in which the most advancements occur in AI, one of the arenas, I should say, is autonomous vehicles and autonomous driving. So I think it's a very unique space in that regard. And therefore, I think another angle is that most of the revolutionary inventions in our history are not necessarily the ones that we knew in advance are going to happen in this and this time. It's some of these like a smartphone or social media or television. It things that once they emerged, society never looked back and adopted it and simply went on. It became a norm, and nobody even would. I read, sorry for the detour, but I read this article about the first days of the subway system in New York, where nobody even believed that people would be willing to go underground because they believed that ghosts live underground. And suddenly once it became efficient enough and available to everyone, nobody looked back. And I think that's what we're going to experience in this next decade.
Alistair, your vision for the next decade?
I agree with, as the guy said, I think we talk too much about kind of evolution, or we talk too much about revolution, and really we were just on an evolution. And I think across that period, we will evolve our knowledge, we will evolve the products, the technology will evolve, it will become smarter, and that will really allow us to increase the adoption and proliferation of the systems as well. So yeah, I think it's yeah. We don't need to think about flying cars and all of these kind of things. It's actually about the hard yards in taking what we have and really challenging that and adopting that and moving forward sustainably.
Thank you very, very much for the discussions. Let's use the last 10 minutes for the Q&A, and I would like to invite everybody to shoot a few questions if there are any. First question that we got: do you expect any worldwide movements in terms of standardization to reduce the amount of variants that needs to be taught to current ADAS systems? For example, lane recognition, road sign recognition, and so on and so on. Any standardization movements globally? Stephen.
I understand this to be the infrastructure question, and to be honest, I would go back to the same thing as we talked about separating autonomous and non-autonomous vehicles, that it would be impractical to do that at this stage. And instead, when we get more into higher levels of software adaptations and potential with the processing power, it just makes sense to use what is existing already. But what actually advances that is the fact we have mapping data and other things as well that are not physical signs and are not physical things that can also assist us, that we can modify easy outside of the physical domain. So if I understand the question right, I see it more like traffic signs in the physical domain, and it's just easier for us to train for it than to replace it across every geographic location and every road sign that exists to make it standard.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think, and also I'm trying to think about the practical situation where all the municipalities and government are now going out to replace signs. I just can't imagine it happening. So
that could become quite expensive, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, being from the UK, we obviously even have outliers where different countries drive on different sides of the road, right? So that means when you're approaching a junction, you're having vehicles oppose you from different sides than you would in another country. So yeah, if we were to go down the route of standardization, we'd be having to teach other people how to or relearn how to drive as well.
Good. We only have one additional question that is very specific. What's the market size for ADAS in North America? I mean, maybe we can discuss it more in relative terms. Say, okay, which market is the biggest one? Europe, North America, Japan, Korea, China. Are there any major differences when it comes to content per vehicle? Nimrod?
I think I won't address specifically the market size question. I think that there is a difference in the way the regulation is operating in the United States compared to Europe and Japan and other places. If you look at the Euro NCAP, which is the regulatory body that is responsible for the standards for safety and 5-star ratings in Europe, the amount or the rate of progress and the increased content in each and every milestone is significant. And I think Europe is kind of leading the charge in terms of regulated ADAS enhancements. And I think the United States is a little bit more towards the opening the room for innovation that comes from the car makers and from the industry itself. And that's where there is a more space for car makers to differentiate.
Agree. As there are no additional questions, I would like to pick up the point that you brought, okay, that NCAP is very important in Europe. I mean, the last 2 decades, we see always striving the OEMs to get the best rating possible. Do you see this continuing the next years, or are there first discussions with your clients, your customers, that, I mean, maybe in the future 3-star rating is sufficient? Stephen?
I think it's very different from car manufacturer today, actually. Some of them are very content with the lower levels because that's enough for what they want to achieve, and some are always striving for the 5 stars, and always want to have that. It's a feather in the hat. But I think that's not the reason to do it, actually. It's because it makes sense, right? And if you look at the latest NCAP, the 2030 vision that came out yesterday or the day before, there's a lot of very positive changes in that make sense. So, I would say that, there will be continuing strives towards a specific level dependent on the architecture, the cost, the price, the targeted audience. But we're following it not just because it exists and we have to, it's because it also makes sense.
Alistair, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I'll just completely echo exactly what Stephen said at the end, that we're following it because it makes sense. It comes back to a point I made before about not just achieving compliance. When we are looking at this, we need to do it from a perspective of not engineering to pass a test, and we need to be very aware and learn lessons from the past that isn't what occurs. This is very much to serve a purpose. I think it helps consumers understand, and again, back to that consumer education piece, and helps them understand what those systems are capable of doing, and how it can support them in the driving task or can take over in certain elements of the driving task. But yeah, very, very cautious about getting to a point where we consider and assess purely based on engineering certain test protocols. It'd be a very dangerous road to go down.
Good. There are still no questions popping up, unfortunately. Maybe we come back to the regional differences that Nimrod already started to explain, that we have very strong regulatory push in Europe, while North America is more looking for innovations from the OEMs. How do you see the Asian OEMs playing this field, Nimrod?
I think it varies between OEMs, again, and I think that generally speaking, we do see that there is kind of a common approach of striving for, again, improved safety. And I think in Japan specifically, it's extremely noticeable that it's a very fundamental aspect of the offering that OEMs want to deliver, and some of them are very vocal about it. And I think that China is characterized with a very quickly evolving and dynamic nature of quick adoption of new technologies, quick launch of new technologies, and I think it also trickles down to outside of China now, because these Chinese OEMs are also delivering their cars outside of China, and then it creates this undercurrent of quicker adoption of new technologies.
Good. A few new questions. Are there any countries being particular anti-ADAS or anti-automated driving? Any region that you came across? Some of you?
No, not that I know of. Not that I've come across.
Yeah.
Alistair?
No. It's not that I'm aware of.
Good. Will ADAS be quickly replaced in units as ADAS is keeping improving, so that we will have, do you see a world where we upgrade technology in existing vehicles or in existing platforms, or it's only a change of software?
I mean,
Stephen.
upgrades is change of software as well, for me.
Yeah.
I think the difference that I see now compared to, just the 6 years ago since I joined the company, is that the OEMs are more interested in putting headroom in all of the units to be able to do that. Whereas at the time it was more, give me what exactly the performance I need to have to fulfill the requirements that we have now. And that, of course, makes it a lot easier for us to do those upgrades going forward. But I mean, I think when you start to get more commonized architectures, I know we talked about that before as well, but when you start to have like a low, medium, high architecture, you can actually add things in the vehicle afterwards. And we do see that happening as well in some customer cases, that they want to have that availability as well. But I would say the easiest way to get to that is to do software upgrades and to have headroom in the first place.
Good. Last question before we need to finish. Alistair, how important will mapping be for future ADAS?
I'm not sure I'm perhaps the best person to answer that, based on Nimrod and Stephen being product guys. I mean, my general view would be absolutely depends on the application, right? If it is to assist in the route planning of that vehicle and localization of that vehicle, then great. I think if it relates to a safety critical function, then yeah, probably a little bit more thought to be put into it. But yeah, I'm not necessarily making products that consume mapping.
Yeah, you know, coming from REM, I cannot leave this question unanswered. I think the way we look at it is that HD maps or a global database, whatever you want to call it, is a different way to think about memory and priors that we as humans use when we drive. So a good example would be trying to think about your daily commute, where you're probably very much familiar with the road and you know everything in advance, and you're probably driving very safely and comfortably, as opposed to landing in a new country, a new city for the first time. You've never been there before. You don't understand, you know, the regulation, the rules, the traffic signs, how you should be driving. And the HD map is supposed to provide this prior information and memory of each and every road, even if the car did not traverse there ever. So I think that's kind of maybe an understandable example of why we think that there is tremendous value in these products for all variants of driver assist and autonomous driving.
Thank you so much to the three of you. It was a great pleasure to have this discussion. Stay safe, and hopefully we see each other quite soon again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.